Welcome to the Adams County Historical Society. We're very fortunate tonight to have as our speaker Ron Coddington, editor and publisher of Military Images magazine. I'll tell you, we fight over the publication when it comes into our offices. Ron is an active collector himself of Civil War era photography, specifically portrait photography and the carte de visite. Ron also has a career as a journalist spanning over 30 years. He's worked with USA Today, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the San Jose Mercury News, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Tonight he's speaking to us, though, as the author of a series of books that combine his passion for photography with his skills as an editor and writer. His series covers the faces of the Civil War, faces of the Confederacy, African-American faces of the Civil War, faces of the Civil War Navies, and faces of Civil War nurses. Tonight, he's addressing his new book, Gettysburg Faces, which I am pleased to tell you I have read thoroughly and loved. And Ron's going to tell us a little bit about the portrait photography of the times, how it evolved, and then how he selected the people to include in his new book, Gettysburg Faces. So let me turn the program over to Ron Coddington.
All right, so we're going to take a look at Gettysburg Faces, Portraits and Personal Accounts. The story that I'm going to tell you tonight really has three parts. I am going to talk a little bit about Civil War portrait photography to help orient you to those unusual, wonderful documentary images. I'm going to talk a little bit about stories and research in the modern era. And then I'm going to give you a little flavor of what happens when you combine portraits and stories together. So, as you know, there are so many different ways to tell the Gettysburg story. You can talk about the battles, you can talk about the leaders, you can view it through the lens of specific units, regiments, brigades, corps. You can look at it in terms of the casualties. You can look at it in terms of the citizens, as the Adams County Historical Society is so wonderful at doing. Another way to view it is through the monuments, through the post-war period, as the veterans were coming back to Gettysburg to remember the battle and the larger campaign. And of course, you can look at it through the battlefield photographs, the Matthew Brady images of Gettysburg and all of his team and other photographers who were there after the battle ended. I want to tell the Gettysburg story in a slightly different way. And my way, the way that really resonates with me, is to look at it through the faces and the stories, through the portrait photographs of these individuals. Specifically, identified people whose stories have been forgotten, overshadowed, or just somehow lost in time. This is not an original idea. When I started working on books and researching Civil War soldiers more than 20 years ago, I came across this quote by the great Scottish historian Thomas Carlyle. In his essay, written in 1830 on history, he says, "History is the essence of innumerable biographies." If you start looking at 19th century, late 1800s, county histories, city histories, you will find that they often have some version of Carlyle's words in their preface or in their foreword. And then, of course, somewhere in the book or in a separate volume, they're going to have a collection of biographies of the citizens who played important roles in founding whatever town or county that they're writing about. And of course, I have my own version based on Carlyle's words, with apologies to him. My version of this is the history of the Civil War is the portraits and stories of its soldiers, sailors, and civilians. So I want to make sure that I'm clear on this. I'm not talking about those wonderful, unknown, in some cases, iconic portraits that were seen by the American public during the war, images like this one of the 3 Confederate prisoners at Gettysburg. I'm really looking at these very personal images, these identified portraits that have been tucked away in albums or displayed on a fireplace mantle, a hearth, a bookshelf, never intended for public consumption. So to better appreciate these photographs, I'm going to do a quick course, Portraits 101. So if you were alive during the Civil War period, you really essentially had 2 choices to make when you walked into the photographer's studio. You could choose a hard plate image, which is on metal or glass. You may have heard the terms or are familiar with daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes. These are unique, artisanal, one-of-a-kind images that were produced in reverse, a lateral reverse on the camera. So they're deeply personal. There's a quote here that I want to share with you from Don Keyes of the Art Journal that I think captures the essence of what these hard plate images are all about. He says, the images were easily carried on one's person and comfortably fitted into the hand. The lateral reversal of the picture meant that the image was familiar only to the sitter, that is, his mirror image as seen by him and only him. So I'm actually giving you my reflection when I give you a hard plate image. And that's powerful, it's meaningful, it's a very personal gift. Now, the other format is paper. And the popular term for that is albumen prints, albumen being a shiny paper, shiny because it's coated with egg whites. And the most popular format during the Civil War period was the carte de visite, or visiting card, a French import about the size of a modern baseball card that arrived coincident with the beginning of the Civil War. These images, in contrast to the hard plates, these are social. And here's a quote that I think will help you appreciate it from John Hanavy in the Encyclopedia of 19th Century Photography. John calls them small, ephemeral commodities, which were widely available, easy to pass around, easy to look over by a dozen within a drawing room, touchy-feely artifacts, not to be looked at with deferential awe, but cataloged, collected, gossiped, and commented upon. If you think about it, it's social media. This is the Facebook of the 1860s. This is the reason that photo albums exist, to put these small carte de visites. Now, how popular were they? Here's a chart that will help you maybe appreciate the fact that the hard plates, which dominated photography for its first 20 years, were beginning to wane as the paper, the social photography, was beginning to ramp up. So the green, gold, and blue bars are the daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and tintypes. The red bar is this carte de visite, and you can see as it's ramping up towards the end of the war. So the Civil War is a very dynamic period when it comes to the popularity and the changing formats of photography. Now, I want to help you appreciate an essential question, at least in my mind. Why did they pose this way? And the truth is, there's a number of ways to answer that question. One of them, and perhaps the most obvious, is the technology. Exposure times were maybe as little as 15 seconds, could be up to 30. That's a long period of time. And so it's not really given to being spontaneous. Though people tried, it wasn't really quite a spontaneous medium at that point. Another explanation, imitation. When you see George Washington posed in a very regal manner, when you look into your history books and you see these engravings of the movers and shakers of society, You imitate what you see. So they're mostly more of a regal, very posed quality. You see that imitated in images. Now, another way to frame it is by the photographer and the photographer's direction. Think of a photographer during the Civil War period as your doctor. Your doctor gives you instructions and you follow those instructions. So here's your photographer telling you what to do. In fact, one photographer who was very much the doctor of photography is Marcus Aurelius Roots. He thought of himself as an artist, and he started out in life as an artist. He wrote a handbook in 1864 for his fellow photographers. Buried deep in that tome are 6 tips for an artful portrait. I'm sparing you the details of the paragraphs and paragraphs of Victorian language to give you a quick hit view of his tips. So here they are. Number 1, the figure should be off center. So when you're looking at these photographs, notice that the individuals may not always be standing exactly in the center. Why? Because it creates visual interest. Number 2, the distance between the lens and the figure should be greater than the figure in the backdrop. Why? Because it makes the frame look more expansive. Number 3, the distance between the top and the bottom of the figure should not be equal. So you'll notice an example. There's more room at the top than at the bottom. Why? Because it makes people look taller. Number 4, the figure should be composed in an engaging manner. If you look at this young man, he is wearing a Union uniform. He has a jaunty tilt to his cap. He's looking off camera. He's at an angle leaning over a chair with an arm on top of that chair. He looks interesting. He looks engaging. Number 5, the figure should be lit at a 45-degree angle. And you'll see in this case, the light coming down from the left, it lights one side of his face. The other side of his face is in shadow. It makes the face look more dimensional. It makes the face look more human. Number 6, last but not least, keep it simple. Here is a soldier. He's sitting on a chair. He pretty much has all of the tips that Root suggested are being followed here. But in its essence, it's really a plain and simple documentary image of a Civil War soldier. Now, one more way to think about this, and this comes from Austin Sundstrom, who wrote a paper a couple of years ago on the subject about personal style. And Austin, his theory is that there's 2 ways that soldiers posed that capture their personal style. One, he calls the restrained style. And these individuals valued faith, family, and business success. And if you look at this officer here, you see how he is very quietly posed. He's holding his weapon of war, but it's not in front of him. It's cradled in his arm. It's off to the lower part of the portrait, and it's gradually disappearing into the foreground. The emphasis is on his face. The sword is secondary. The other choice is this one, the martial pose. These individuals embraced physical domination. Look at the array of weapons. There's at least 4, I believe, maybe even more. And he wants you to see the musket, the saber. They're actually framing his portraits. And on top of that, his Hardee hat with the cavalry insignia is right in the foreground. So he's telling you, I'm a military person, and this is a martial portrait. So now I want to get a little bit to the stories. I want to just spend a couple of slides here talking about what we can do nowadays. The modern research tools that we have, all as a result of the digital age, are nothing short of amazing. Newspapers.com, Ancestry, Find a Grave, Internet Archive, Google Books, Fold3. The list goes on and on and on. The research, the access to research, to primary source documents, and I'm not even mentioning the historical societies like Adams County Historical Society, the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian Institution, all of these state and local organizations that have these repositories that are going digital, are for the first time bringing out primary source documents and other materials that have been largely tucked away for decades and decades, in some cases more than a century. And so when you're researching someone in the pre-digital age, you might think to go to the local library and get the microfilm of the local newspaper and search for hours and hours and hours to try to find a mention of that person. Nowadays, you can go right onto newspapers.com, assuming the local newspaper is there, and do a quick search and find every reference to this individual. Better than that, you might find that he had a comrade that lived in another town, perhaps another state, who wrote about his Civil War experience and mentioned the soldier you're researching. So the digital world can take you places that you might not have even imagined existed if you were in the pre-digital environment. So a huge shout out to what has been happening online. And because of this, a new generation of researchers, all of us that are around today, we have the ability to use these tools to tell stories that we were never able really to tell in the past. So it's making us think differently about the Civil War and giving us the ability to tell stories, different stories than some of the traditional stories that have appeared in the past. So I also want to give a shout out to the collecting community. On a completely separate track, you have a dedicated group of Civil War collectors, and I number myself among the obsessed. I've been that way since I was a kid. These collectors largely think of themselves as caretakers or keepers of history. I'm showing you some images of Military Images, the magazine that I've been editing since 2013. The magazine itself has been around since 1979 to help collectors and those who are interested in the humanity and the personal stories of the war to showcase, interpret, and preserve these images. So over the last 9 years, I've been dedicating an issue, our summer issue, to Gettysburg. And since I came into the editorship, we've published more than 150 stories of Gettysburg identified soldiers and others who had an interesting Gettysburg experience. So I had the unique opportunity to be able to look at those 150 images and select 100 of them, do additional research, and then to be able to put them together in book form, which is Gettysburg Faces. So if you take all of those 100 individuals, I was a bit more expansive about it. I looked over the entire Gettysburg campaign. So what I did is I plotted all 100 of those individuals and their unique Gettysburg experiences on a map. And so in this particular crop, I'm not showing you the larger view, which goes all the way out to capture the other engagements in the campaign, but just focusing in on Gettysburg, the battlefield proper. You've got about 75 or 80 red squares. Each of these red squares indicate the location of where one of the soldiers or citizens in the book was located and had a unique experience. And so it's perhaps not a surprise that they're clustered around the first day, the second day, and the third day of the battle. So all of that is to say that you can take these photographs and these stories and create what I believe is a cohesive narrative that takes you through the entire Gettysburg campaign, through the faces and the stories of those who lived it. So that was my goal in the book. And so I want to take the rest of this program, and I selected about 15 or 16 images and stories from the book. I want to give you a flavor of how you can bring these images together to tell a story. So what you're about to see is a quick view and a quick summary of what the book expands on. So if you all are ready, and I hope you are, I'm going to take you through the version of the Gettysburg campaign through the faces and stories of these individuals. Jeb Stuart's cavalry and artillery screened the Army of Northern Virginia as it marched north. Union cavalry patrols discovered Stuart's forces on June 21st at a crossroads near Upperville, Virginia. In the clash that followed, a Union cannon shot struck Charlie Saunders in the leg above the knee. Medical help did not arrive in time. Charlie would never know of the momentous battle at another crossroads town in Gettysburg. Fears for the safety of 500 patients at the military hospital in York, Pennsylvania, only grew as the Confederate invasion progressed. One of the hospital stewards, Al Cheney, organized 400 of the ambulatory patients into a battalion. On June 28th, as General Jubal Early's corps descended on York, the 400 patients marched to safety. Cheney stayed behind with the remaining 100 men who were not mobile. Loaded into wagons and ambulances, he led them out of harm's way. As Captain Erastus Clark and his men camped about 5 miles south of Gettysburg, a teenaged boy showed up and volunteered to fight the Rebs. Clark and others were suspicious of the boy's motives, but soon realized he was Union loyal. They scrounged up a blue coat, a cap, a musket, and equipment for the boy, and he joined Clark's company. The next day, July 1st, the regiment suffered heavy casualties along Oak Ridge. The long list of severely wounded included Clark and the boy. Isaac Maul and his comrades wore bucktails on their caps as a constant reminder that much was expected from them in battle. The 1st Bucktail Regiment, organized a year earlier, had won laurels for its combat abilities. It also inspired the organization of the 2nd Bucktail Brigade, including Mull and the 149th Infantry. Mull marched into Gettysburg carrying his muskets and the weight of the Bucktail reputation. He did his job, and it cost him his life along McPherson Ridge. As Mike Link and his regiment fought along the ridge near the Lutheran Seminary, a bullet struck him in the right side of his head and passed all the way through. His last memory was seeing a rebel flag waving in front of him, and then darkness overtook him. He rolled down into a rut and remained there for the better part of several days. When he finally got to a hospital and when surgeons finally examined him 11 days after he was shot, they told him what he already knew, that the blindness was permanent. A soldier recalled seeing Anna Etheridge in uniform and on horseback as she directed care of the Union wounded near the Trossel House. The soldier wrote about her, quote, "She was cool and self-possessed and did not seem to mind the fire." Another soldier, another eyewitness, saw her, and he had an interesting observation. He said, quote, "I remember the wounded crying for water and that noble woman, Anna Etheridge, trying to alleviate their sufferings. I have seen her under fire, riding along as unconcerned as the headquarters staff." A recent German immigrant Ernst Miller and his fellow Minnesotans paid a premium in blood to buy precious minutes to slow advancing Confederates and bring up Union reinforcements. 82% of the 262 Upper Midwest boys became casualties in a matter of minutes, including Miller, who suffered a debilitating gunshot wound in his right thigh. In battle for the first time, Ben Campbell led his company of Texans into a storm of artillery and musket fire as they crossed low ground, sloping up towards Triangular Field and, beyond it, the Union line along Houck's Ridge. As he spurred his Texans forward, a bullet struck him directly in the chest. Ben would have celebrated his 22nd birthday the next day. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, Lucius Larrabee knew he would be killed in his next fight. 2 months later at Gettysburg, he handed off his watch and other personal possessions to fellow officers. Of course, they said, "You're going to be fine. Nothing's going to happen." As they all hurried into line along Little Round Top, Lucius turned to one of the officers and said, "Goodbye, Billy. I shall never see you again." He did not. George Hancock and his fellow artillerists in Parker's Virginia Battery went into action early on the third day of the battle and worked their guns till early evening. When the guns fell silent, they counted 1,142 rounds fired by their battery. George suffered a minor wound at some point in the action. After Pickett's charge began, U.S. Signal Corpsmen at General Meade's headquarters deemed the position unsafe, packed up their equipment, and withdrew. One man, Davis Castle, refused to abandon his post. Without a signal flag, he improvised one with a crude pole and a bedsheet. With this makeshift banner, he sent dispatches as enemy artillery fire continued to roar around him, and he remained in position until it subsided. An aide to Brigadier General Lewis Armistead at Gettysburg, Ben Hawthorne accompanied his superior officer into Pickett's charge. The general famously did not return. Ben suffered a gunshot wound in the left arm, and somehow he managed to make his way back across the field, littered with dead and dying men, and to safety. 50 years later, in 1913, at the Blue and Gray reunion, he reenacted the same charge. Hearing a groan come from a dead cart, or a cart full of dead soldiers, a Union soldier found John Chase regaining consciousness. The stunned soldier gave John a drink of water. His first reported words were, "Did we win the battle?" After learning the answer, he was transported away from the scene to a hospital where surgeons treated him for a missing arm, a damaged eye, and 48 separate shrapnel wounds. As she rode in an ambulance to Gettysburg, Nurse Hattie Dada saw firsthand a town dealing in the aftermath of a mass casualty event. She said, quote, "Nearly every house had the red hospital flag, and here and there were stacks of guns which had been gathered from the battlefield. Off at the left of the road and the edge of the woods could be seen the newly made graves of those who had fallen. Hattie preferred field work over city hospitals. She said this over and over again, and she soon got plenty of it at Gettysburg." Susie Hare lived in Gettysburg and helped wounded Union soldiers hold up in the Adams County Courthouse. Jacob Gundrum, a German-born musician, lent a hand wherever he could with the wounded, and a little bit later on, he played tunes with his brigade band to cheer the wounded and sick soldiers. Somewhere in this cauldron of death and dying, Jacob and Susie met and fell in love. Their courtship ended in marriage, children, and a lifetime together. So thank you so much for listening to the program. I really appreciate your time and your interest and your support of history and the Civil War.
Thank you very much, Ron. I'm curious, you referred to some of the people there by their nicknames. Did we know their nicknames?
Yes. In every situation where I used a nickname, this is the result of research that I did. Some of the sites that I mentioned earlier in the program, where they are referred to by the name that they were known by their pals and by their families.
So that's legitimate. It's not because you've been working with them so long that you feel.
Well, I feel like I know them. I feel like I've come to know them.
Yes.
But true to the research, I use their names, their nicknames when I can find them.
I have to say, the photographs, the way you have presented them in the book, are spectacular. I am so impressed that you printed them all, full page. That is amazing. Most people, and often I find in slideshows, they'll frame something so that it looks pretty, but you can't see anything. In your case, I found myself thumbing through the book, just staring at the faces. I was mesmerized because I could see them. They seemed very, very real. So congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. That was a very conscious decision. I have to give a shout out to Kevin Drake of Gettysburg Publishing. He is a very hands-on publisher, and we had numerous conversations about what the presentation of this book should be. And together, we really both felt strongly that in order to really appreciate these stories and these images, we want you to have the experience that you just described. So we went full color while being mindful of keeping the price point reasonable, going full color and then cropping them in such a way where you really, really get to see, you get to look them in the face.
So Ron, I have to ask you, I see in the book that you have given credits to the individual collectors who have contributed their photos for the book, and many of these are yours. How and when did you personally become involved in collecting these amazing photographs from the Civil War?
I got my start when I was a teenager. I had the collecting gene before Civil War photography came into my view. Old bottles, baseball cards. There was an event when I was, I think, 13. It was, the 1976 Topps baseball card set. I was able for the first time to buy all 660 in the series, which was wonderful until I got it. And I realized, oh my gosh, the collecting part of it is sort of done because I now have the entire set. So it wasn't long after that. It was the next year when I was 14. My parents had got the flea market bug, and they took us to various places. I grew up in New Jersey, various flea markets. And at one of these flea markets, there was a table just piled high with broken photograph albums. The bindings had long since disintegrated. And on the top of the pile was a photograph of a man in uniform. And being a kid and seeing it and realizing this was something about it spoke to me in a very strong way. And I went back to the car, to the family station wagon without it. And one of my brothers turned to me and said, "You're not going to buy that photograph?" Because he saw me looking at it so intently. So I went back and I took the $4 out of my pocket and I bought it. And that proved to be such an amazing experience for me because his name was written on the album page. I learned who he was. I learned that he wasn't a soldier. He was a sailor. He served on a gunboat in the Mississippi River. He lived a long life afterwards. So it was really my introduction to collecting Civil War photography, to researching, and to understanding history in a very personal way. And so that got me going. And so I was also an aspiring artist. So I was really wanted to learn how to draw portraits. So I would buy a photograph every weekend, every Sunday, buy a photograph out with mom and dad. I would draw that person during the week, and then I'd buy another one. And so it helped me to learn how to be an artist. And then I continued collecting through high school, through college, through marrying my lovely wife, Anne, through jobs, and to today. So I'm still as fascinated today as I was when I bought that first photograph in 1977.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing those photographs with us. I've thoroughly enjoyed the book. I hope you will consider coming back again and talking to us about what you have in the first part of your book, which is a history of collecting. I had no idea how the industry had changed so much over the years.
I would love to do that. So put me down for a date. The modern collecting community really traces back to the 1960s and a centennial. But you could really go back and look at the Civil War soldiers and sailors, the citizens and their families. They were really the first collectors, but there's a through line that goes from them to us. But in the 1960s, you have a big movement where Civil War photography and other relics really become collectible. And perhaps more importantly, there's an appreciation for their historic value. And each of them, whether it's a photograph, a weapon, a uniform, they're something that you can talk about and get a sense of the larger history connected to it.
Fabulous. Well, I urge all of our viewers tonight, you still have time to buy the book in time for Christmas. It is a wonderful book. It's available on Amazon, and we will have it also in our gift store at the new museum here at the Adams County Historical Society. Thank you so much, Ron, and we will see you soon, I hope.
Thanks, Antigone. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight.